Alright, guys, welcome back to Theory and Theology. Here we talk about different theories, different theologies, different literature, and beliefs and traditions about different cultures, different religions, and spirituality topics. And lately I've been kind of curious about the origins of the Christian church. Now, I know basically some of the original information, but I've lately become more and more curious about like a picture of it, right? Because we kind of see the Old Testament, and then we see all of a sudden here comes the New Testament, like way later. And the New Testament wasn't even written during the actual physical time of Jesus being on the planet, like walking around on earth as a human being. It was written after, like 300 years after, I believe. Don't quote me on that, but I think that that's kind of what it looked like. And I was studying from this Catholic website. It's a YouTube channel. It just has a lot of like Catholic priests. Catholicism compared to Protestantism, I'm not too sure which one's larger, in all honesty. I really wish I knew, like, which has more people. But they are quite different from one another. I kind of started out trying to figure out, like, how does Christian Orthodox churches, because there are Ethiopian, there's Greek, there's Roman, there's a lot of different types of Assyrian, there's a lot of different types of Orthodox faiths, and how come they look so different from Christianity, from other forms of Christianity, like from most Protestant, denominations, and then comparing those to Catholicism. I was thinking about it. I was like, I've never really been to a Catholic church, which is interesting. As many Catholic people as I know, I've never been to a Catholic church. My childhood friend, neighbor, when we used to live not far from LAX, went to St. Jerome's, and I think it's still technically in Westchester in LA. He grew up Catholic and he went to a Catholic school. I remember him talking about his first communion, and I had like no idea what he was talking about, but he was talking about that it was going to be his first communion. And I remember he and his brother went to St. Jerome's school, and it seemed, let me see, I never really, in high school, when I was not at an Adventist school, when I went to public college, and I was definitely raised around a lot of people who were Christian of different types, but I didn't know that many people who were too active in their religion or denomination. So I've always been pretty fascinated with like Orthodox and Catholic churches. They do have a lot of traditions that you never ever see or hear about in Protestant church, like ever. Like ever. Like you never, like, the cool thing about YouTube is you can like actually watch live services of all different types of religions. Not like every single possible religion has like a service online that you can visually watch, but I do like that you have churches that you can watch. Not even necessarily for like the doctrine or what they're teaching about or whatever, but even just culturally to be able to like go online and watch what somebody did on a certain date, as if you were there, and you can kind of look and just visually see what's going on, at least what the camera is capturing, and you can see it, and it's like it kind of opens up a door to like so many different worlds that you would probably, not have the time or money or energy or comfort to just like walk in and like be like, oh, I'm gonna go to this service now. Like, I'm very weird with dress codes. I'm pretty sure most of the religions wouldn't let me come into their services because of me not being willing to kind of change up how I want to dress. And that would definitely close doors for me, but it's like I can sit in my room on my phone and watch, Orthodox churches or Catholic churches, or even like synagogues or, Muslim services. Like, I can sit and like watch different cultures do different things and different ceremonies and services and traditions, and I'm always learning about all kinds of weird stuff. To me, that's weird because it's like I haven't even heard of it. Like, I go way in these rabbit holes. I was watching this video today, randomly, about this cultural, like, I don't even know what part of the world it's from. I didn't even look into the whole thing. I just saw it kind of in passing. It was it was about the summer solstice celebration of this one culture. The people looked like they were some kind of maybe Asian group, maybe somewhere close to Russia, Uzbekistan, something like that. Like, and they had this, I don't think it was that country specifically, but, they had this, cultural festival. It was almost, the way it seemed like it had some spiritual aspects to it. There was a shaman that like opened the ceremonies, and then they had different kind of like physical activities. And I think it was called, I don't know if it said like during the coldest part of the year, but it was in their summer. I don't know. That would mean that it was like below the equator. I don't really know, man. I don't really know. But yeah, it talked about the summer solstice, and it had these other people doing these different kind of competitions. So there was one where like these guys would hold each other by their arms with their feet touching like a almost triangular looking beam that was on the floor, and they were seated on opposite sides of this beam holding hands, and they would have to pull on each other's arms with their feet touching this thing, and then one of them would have to pull the other one out of their seated position. Whoever was stronger could pull the other one up from their own seated position, and whoever was seated the longest basically won. There's another one that was like a kind of looked like a long jump, or like that 3 kind of like skip hop jump thing that they do in track and field. It was like it looked like you did something before you would do like 1 hop, 2 hops, 3 hops, and then 1, 2, I don't know if it was 3, 2 of the 2 feet together kind of hops, but like really far. And there was like a race and like all kinds of like competitions, and everyone was wearing like like clothing, like traditional clothing of their culture. I'd never heard of anything like that, but I found it interesting that it was like a traditional summer solstice competition that happened every year. And I mean, that was really cool to see. And I felt like I was in another century, but literally it's like still going on these days. So I was just like, wow, what is this? Like, it was pretty cool. It almost felt like some like medieval times kind of thing, but like with a little bit different cultural twist on it. Like, I don't know how to explain it. I'm way off topic. It's late and I can't sleep, so I'm recording. But basically, yeah, I've been trying to study about the early church, and I just found it kind of interesting. Some of the little things that I found, they're just things that I never really thought about. But, you know, I'm always having, like, if I can't visualize it all the way through, then I'm like, in my head, I don't really know it, right? So it's like, I kind of learned that almost with, like, doing therapy. It's like, if you can't visualize the scenario, then, you know, you might need to learn a little more about how to help that type of scenario. But from a lot of different perspectives, from different cultural perspectives, because everyone you talk to is going to come from different cultural backgrounds. And so if you don't know it from a perspective that would be helpful to a certain type of person that's in a certain type of situation from a certain type of background, all those variables with their background, then that's when it's like, okay, you might need to sit and work through that and see if you can figure that one out. But I was noticing that with the church, and with Christianity, I was like, okay. So I get the part up to, you know, Jesus, you know, being unfortunately crucified, and, you know, ascending to heaven and returning to reveal himself. And then, you know, all that's left are the 11 apostles. And because Judas is gone by this point. And then they go to replace him with to make a 12th apostle. So going back just real quick to the apostles, 11 of them were, you know, personally picked by Jesus, and Judas kind of came by himself, but 11 of them were personally chosen by Jesus. He sought them out. And I always find it interesting that in pictures, everybody looks so old. Like, maybe they did look really old because, you know, in those times, you know, people didn't live that long a lot of the time. But, you know, if Jesus was in his 30s, I know when we think of him now, he was basically up to nearly 8. He was a baby. He was nearly age 12. And then you see him in his 30s. And that's basically all you really see of Jesus' age ranges. But you see him basically as a not so old person. Like, there were still people who had parents living when they were, you know, his mother was alive, but his mother, technically they say that his mother was already pretty young, like 14 or so, potentially. And then people say that Joseph was probably way older, like maybe in his 30s or 40s. I don't really know where these numbers come from, but you know, potentially Mary was very young when she had Jesus. So if he's in his 30s let's give him like 33 or something like that, she would be 47, which isn't that old. She would have been older, but not like so old that she was like not expected to be still living, but potentially by the end of Jesus' life in his 30s, Joseph would have been not living anymore. But going back to the apostles, when Jesus first chose his students, according to Rob Bell in his book Velvet Elvis, he talks about traditionally how the disciples would have been younger. They would have been not like 60-year-old looking men. Because when you think about it, if Jesus was in his 30s, with a few-year ministry, he probably wasn't picking people that were in their 60s. I mean, not trying to be ageist, but just thinking about it. Because in theory, if these people were working and they were out casting nets and they were fishermen, they probably didn't have kids by this point. They were probably a younger age range. They didn't have kids. They likely didn't have families. It didn't sound like they had like wives and kids. And some of them had fathers. So they likely were younger if their fathers were working with them. Because if you're in like your 60s back then, you probably weren't like out in the water fishing and all that kind of stuff. You probably had kids that were taking care of you in your older age. You would have been very elderly by your 60s. You could still be alive, but you would have been very elderly by your 60s. It wouldn't make sense that there are all these like 60-year-old men out there, casting nets, and then Jesus in his 30s comes in as like, I'll make you fishers of men. Like, it makes more sense that they were probably newly rejected youth, like Rob Bell was saying, like potentially they were newly rejected youth that didn't make it to that whole temple system that was going on at the time and weren't chosen to study in the synagogues, and so they weren't traditionally learning as Jews, and they were working instead. They weren't chosen to be in the temples learning as scholars. They were chosen, they basically didn't meet up to the higher rabbis' standards, but Jesus was a rabbi. So something had happened where Jesus became a rabbi and was noticed as a rabbi by the Pharisees, by others, from the temple scribes. You always see them, looking at what he says. I could be wrong about them thinking of him as a rabbi, but many people, when they came up to him, did approach him saying rabbi, and so they were acknowledging that about him. So he was at least acknowledged by some people, if not everybody, thinking he was a rabbi already when he was, around the time when he was having his apostles and things. So it's very possible that he was accepted as a young scholar to learn under the yoke of one of the chosen rabbis. Which rabbi, I don't know, but he was possibly considered a student of another rabbi, which is why he wasn't really seen too much past age 12, or he was possibly, some people say that he fled to India or some other part of the world, and that's why there were those missing years of Jesus. But either way, he comes back, gets baptized by John the Baptist, his cousin, and he was also Jewish. So Jesus was Jewish, John the Baptist was Jewish. You see all these apostles that were Jewish. They were likely younger. I mean, some of them were tax collectors and, had different, professions. So they could have potentially been a little bit older, but they probably weren't, 60s, 70 years old. They were probably younger age because they were still working men. So they were young enough to all be able to have jobs, even if they were tax collectors and different kind of jobs. And then you see basically Peter during Jesus being arrested and crucified, and Peter's there the whole time, and they ask basically what it is that let's get a 12. Peter kind of opens this conversation, or someone does, where Peter speaking, saying we should choose somebody. So from Acts 1 verse 21, it's saying we should choose somebody who's been there with Jesus from the time he was baptized until the time he ascended. And they chose the possible people who were there. The names they listed were 2 people, but one of them had 3 names, which was, I don't understand that yet, but it said the 2 options were Joseph called Barsabbas, who was also known as Justice, and there was a second guy named Matthias. Now, I find it interesting that someone who was raised in a church for so long, these aren't the first times I'm hearing these names, but they never really stuck out to me. So I'm not sure though if Barsabbas means son of Sabbas. I'm not really too sure about that. But a lot of times you see Bar meaning son of. So it's possible. So I don't know why they would have Joseph, who was called Barsabbas. Maybe there were a lot of Josephs, and so they called him by his father's son of whoever. But he was also known as Justice, which is a whole different language, right? I could be wrong about that too. And then there's Matthias. These are people I've never heard of. These people. But basically, as they teach with the history along this story, is that this, prayerful conversation time period was happening about 9 days after Jesus had ascended. And preaching happened shortly after that. And in Judea, and basically the church went from being approximately 500 people to 3,000 people in that time period, right after Jesus had ascended. And I got to thinking about it, and I was like, okay, so the initial Jews were chosen by Jesus. There were 500 people. The majority of them were probably Jewish. And then they became 3,000 people, which wouldn't have all been Jewish people. And that's the first, well, that's not the first converting, but it's, early converting, it seemed like the church when Jesus was there was kind of more of like a nomadic type of people going from one place to another. Like, you don't really hear about them saying who went to church or whatever. You hear about them talking about the temple and, that people were preaching in the temple or other things like that. Like, there was never really any mention of a church until later on in the book of Acts, when you start seeing, the preaching happening after Jesus had ascended. And it starts growing rapidly and getting really confusing. And I was listening to this podcast about these guys that were kind of asking the question, why? Like, why would a Jew want to become Christian, and why would a non-Jew want to become Christian? It's like there's no benefit necessarily for a non-Jew to become Christian. For someone from a pagan religion or some other kind of religion to become a Christian, with Christianity as it was, because at that time period it still mirrored Judaism. And I'm not saying that people wouldn't want to become Jewish or whatever. I'm just saying if people already had their own culture and their own beliefs, what was it that was enticing them to come to this monotheistic religion, where they have a belief in Jesus, and then they have all these Jewish rituals, including things like circumcision. You'd have to be circumcised. Later on, there's this conversation about, like, you don't really have to be circumcised to become, Jewish or to become Christian. But to become Jewish, you become circumcised at your 8th day after birth, after being born. So it's just kind of an interesting picture of, the early church being Jewish, like kind of an offshoot of Judaism, but it doesn't sound a lot like Judaism either. Because John the Baptist as well as Jesus were kind of not fully adherent to, those laws that were being taught by the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the people who were kind of the religious people in charge. And it seems like the powers at the time, Rome being in charge, they didn't really care about Christians, doing their thing. They didn't really care too much until the Pharisees got them involved. It was the Pharisees in their ear that was like kind of more on a political end, getting them involved. Near the time of Jesus' birth, with, was it Herod that was trying to kill all the babies and not let Jesus be born, and then, John the Baptist got killed. A lot of these things were like political. There was a lot of politics going on trying to like stop this thing. And it sounds like there were Jewish politics going on that were kind of cloaked in the religion, kind of getting in the ear of Roman leaders to get them to take out Christianity. And little did they know that the people who were still believers, even if the leader got killed, they were still spreading even more. If they only got up to 500 people within that couple years, but then already had expanded right after Jesus' ascension to 3,000 people within the first wave. After that, there's like the eunuch from Ethiopia that got the message as well and was baptized and spread things, and Philip comes up, and there's all these different people. Like, the whole book of Acts is just like story after story after story of different groups of people. And then after that, you have the book of Romans, First and Second Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians. These are types of people, right, that are all getting, talked about for their belief or what they're doing. But the early church seems like after the death of Jesus, it spread like wildfire all over the world. And it's just a complex story, because it's like they weren't all becoming Jews, but they weren't all becoming Christians as we know Christianity today either. Because modern Christianity doesn't even look like it did back then. And Christianity back then didn't necessarily look like Judaism either. So it's kind of hard to know what it was looking like. Like, there weren't really like all these large like cathedrals and buildings and Christian churches and mega churches and things like that. Like, people were studying and learning out of people's homes. There were a lot of home churches. It wasn't like there was a temple where people went and they worshipped in this one temple. That didn't really exist like that. For Judaism it did. For Christianity it didn't at that time. There was no Catholicism yet. There was no Pope yet. It's just interesting to think about, because it's like, what were these people doing? Like, they were traveling everywhere. And when you think about the places they went, it's like they didn't have like planes and buses and stuff. Like, they were traveling by foot, by maybe animal, maybe. Like, it's like they were traveling everywhere. And it's like they've probably traveled more places than I've ever been in my whole life. When I think of it, like Paul, he was all over the place. These guys were getting arrested everywhere. It's just like, it just looks like a big mess. Like, and I try to like picture it, and I'm like, what were they doing? Like, what was drawing these people to this? Like, what was the message they were hearing? Like, I know the message that we hear these days, but it sounds more like it was more like on a political level, that people were kind of thinking of a Messiah returning soon, very, very soon, to overthrow the current power that was corrupt. And I don't know if people were taking it as a religion without the political side. I can even think about it in today's situation with the economy as it is, and COVID on the rise and on the loose, and all sorts of like people scared of losing their work and their livelihood. I could easily see somebody come along being like, look, I've got all the answers for you. We see that the system that you're living in is full of greed and corruption, and here's a message. If you follow this thing, we've got somebody coming pretty soon that's gonna like handle this, and you just have to follow. And then they see everybody else is following it, and of course a lot of people would follow. It wouldn't really have to look like a religion necessarily, with like prayers and God and things like that. Like, it could be any kind of a movement. And I don't know, I just find it interesting that the early church had this whole movement going on. And I just wonder, how the church got to kind of where it is now compared to how it was then. Like, it's like it's just interesting to me that it doesn't appear to be the same thing necessarily. And I'm not saying that like Christianity has to look exactly like it did like 2,000 something years ago. Like, what do I know? Like, I don't know anything, I'm not saying that like just because something doesn't look like an old tradition, because traditions over time change, they adapt, even when people try so hard to keep it the same. Like I mentioned, I watch a lot of cultural content of people who are doing things that they still did like a couple thousand years back. And different tribal groups and different groups of people adapting to other groups of people coming in, and different groups taking on certain traditions that they didn't have before. Like, for example, an easy example is in the mental health field. When I first started school in college in like 2003 or whatever, September or so of 2002, when I first started college, you would not really hear a lot about meditation, about yoga, about breath work. And now, you almost can't talk to a psychologist without that coming out of their mouth as some type of a coping skill, right? It's something that's adapted from Eastern spirituality. And then they basically sifted out the spirituality and the religious background for things and found the meaty benefits of it, and took it and studied it, and found that these certain steps work for people to feel healing benefits of some kind, right? That's an easy example of somebody's, religion and beliefs and spiritual practices being taken and just not even totally used in like spiritual methods. When you talk about modern psychology in the Western world, we're not using that in a religious way. Now, sometimes you can talk to clients about it. If it's something that they believe, you can mention their religion, or even with Christians, there might be some form of meditation and that kind of stuff. But, you're not teaching the direct background from those cultures. You're not talking about where it came from and like all the other traditional benefits that come with it. We don't learn about that in psychology like at all, unless you go out of your way to learn about it, or unless you already knew it because it's actually your own culture. So that's just one example of how something can be pulled out from something else and people still using it, and it's not even the same thing. It's like, I do wonder if the spirituality aspect was kind of pulled out of Christianity and plopped into a lot of the new people's ideas in a political way. Not that the apostles did it, but maybe that's kind of a message that would have easily spread. But then it's also, I don't know, it's just weird, because we have like Christianity these days has like an organized religious system. I feel like then it didn't really have like an organized religious system of like go to church on Sunday and do all this and that. Like, they weren't even going to church on Sunday yet. So, but then it seems like around the time when the Bible was actually written, the church would have already changed a lot too. And it's just interesting, you don't really get too much of a picture of what that looks like from reading the Bible. You just see the people getting converted, and then they start like mixing all these different cultures together, and then starting to have more and more conversations about how we're going to do this, how's this going to look, like what is it, visually going to look like who can call themselves this or that, what are the rules. You can't have like a religious movement with like no rules, and everybody's just like, oh yeah, I agree, let me go get baptized, and then like just go do my own thing. They kind of eventually started coming up with rules and locations, and throughout history, one thing just kind of led to another. There were a lot of wars, a lot of different stuff, but and then Christianity became an organized state religion made legal. It was no longer, just these people doing this thing. It was the actual religion. But a lot of it was changed by then. I mean, by the time it was actually a religion, it was changed into something completely different. A lot of pagan rituals were introduced and all these different things, and I'm not knocking it. I'm just saying, like, the picture changes over a few hundred years to basically a form of Judaism that looks a little different, but nobody was denying Judaism necessarily back then. They were just saying, yes, let's add Jesus to this picture, and no, let's not be so strict and, dividing ourselves and, shunning certain groups of people and stuff. Let's not do that. And then there were people who believed, no Jesus, we're not adding Jesus, and we're gonna keep shunning everybody. Those were kind of the different sides. But yeah, it's an interesting picture to try to really paint, because it's easy to believe that, like, Christians during Jesus' time were kind of doing the same exact thing that Christians are doing nowadays. And it's like, dude, during Jesus' time, they weren't celebrating Christmas like this, or Easter, or Halloween, or, they didn't even have the same holidays. The ones who came from Judaism were the minority of the people who were, compared to the ones who were converted. There were way more people who were of all these different Greek and pagan and Roman and different backgrounds, Asian and African backgrounds, that were becoming Christians that were not Jewish. They weren't Jewish people. And so they didn't know what it had looked like before, because they were coming from their own lens. And so it's just interesting. And I'm trying to find, what would be the closest type of very first service that was introduced that's the most similar to what modern day Christians are doing. What would be the most close that you could look at online that would look similar? It probably wouldn't look similar to what Jesus and John the Baptist were doing when Jesus and John the Baptist were living. It wouldn't look too similar to the early church right after Jesus' ascension, like right before Matthias got chosen. Or it wouldn't look very similar to before the eunuch spread the gospel to the Ethiopians in Africa. Or it wouldn't look the same as it did when Constantine first started, making, the religion a legal, political state religion. It would have looked different at all of those stages. And I don't know if there's anything online that represents any of that, which is kind of interesting. because it's so different at all the different stages, I guess there's not really one. There would have to be multiple that kind of held to like different things from those early churches. Most likely whatever would be the closest to Judaism might be the closest to an earlier service that could have potentially been held if there were Jewish people still worshiping, and believing in Jesus. And it also seems like the concept and idea of Messiah were different concepts at different points. That, the Messiah was, considered maybe like a political ruler that was supposed to come back, or a religious and political figure that was supposed to come and bring the Jews to their promised, future, versus Jesus being God. Those are completely different things. Versus Jesus being, coming back after, the ascension, and coming back very, very soon to overthrow the Romans. These ideas are so different from one another that I don't really think there's really a church that exists that looks like any of that. The church today does definitely hold to a lot of the pagan ideas, and then there are churches that are kind of like, we don't want any of the pagan stuff here. And then there are other churches that say, we don't want the pagan stuff here, but we do the Jewish stuff. But we believe in Jesus. And then you have Jewish people. And then there's Islam that's like all the way like some other branch that went some other direction. Combined of Jews and Christians and converts of all over the world. So, it's just, I was thinking of it though, because I was like, I want to see what's one of the earlier churches. Like, yeah, Catholicism's early, Orthodoxy is early. There were a lot of denominations that came out in the 1800s and the 1400s, the 1100s. Around 300. These are basically mini versions of religion, and they all kind of do something a little bit different. So it's just interesting, I kind of like to kind of go back and just like take a step way back, as you can tell, and just be like, how do things look different now than they did then? They probably looked way different then. They look way different now. So, and I'm not saying it like in a judgmental way. I just think it's kind of interesting and cool, but like, also it's like, wow, like when you think about it, it's like, things really do change over time. Traditions really do change over time. A lot of the ways we interpret a lot of the things in the Bible these days don't really interpret the way that they would have back then. A lot of traditions we have, people then wouldn't have had. Or things that we are or aren't allowed to do based on how we were raised and things. Like, it's kind of interesting, like when they said like Matthias was chosen and they cast lots. They cast lots to see if it was going to be this Joseph Barsabbas justice guy who was chosen, or Matthias. And they cast lots, and Matthias was the one. After they prayed and cast lots, Matthias was chosen. And I'm thinking about like even how people get chosen to positions these days. Usually churches are like structured and they choose a nominating committee or something like this. And the nominating committee is based on who the pastor and other people like deacons and other people in higher positions decide. Seems like on the surface they do enough of the tradition and religion to be chosen, as a leader to help choose other people to lead different areas, like with the children or the food or whatever. And it's like, we don't cast lots, you never have a service where they're like, okay, all these people, please stand up, and then we're going to pray, and then we're going to cast lots. I have never heard of anything like that. And I think my belief of casting lots seems a little bit more like gambling. I've been told that there was like another kind of more spiritual like version of a decision that's like hidden from man but is kind of made by some kind of higher power. That's more so what it was. It wasn't like rolling dice or anything like that, but it's still, I don't know. I mean, if it was some kind of like spiritual sign that they were asking for, I've never really even seen a church do something like that. Usually it's very controlled, very structurally controlled, with people making decisions based on their own perceptions. It might be led by prayer, but it might be led by some spiritual divine force, like deciding who's in charge of what. But I've never heard it being called cast lots. And I'm not judging it. I'm just saying, like, that's just so different. It's so different to say that somebody's casting lots. Well, I'm finally tired and I need to go to bed because I gotta work. So I'm gonna stop recording, but it's a lot of food for thoughts. I know I like to talk about different cultures, but I also really like to talk about Christianity. I mean, in case you have not noticed. But the thing I like about it is because I have a deeper background in it. It's kind of hard for me to like go too deep into other backgrounds when I don't really know much about them. It really takes a lot more research, and so sometimes it's just a little more fun for me when I'm just wanting to record something that I already know something about, but then I still have like questions related to it. It's kind of like, what on earth is going on? But I don't know. I like this kind of stuff, as you guys know, so I'm gonna keep talking about it unless it's offending people. Or that's not true. Even if it is offending people, I'm still gonna talk about it. Because like I say, I'm not trying to laugh at any of it. Even if I do laugh at any of it, I'm not trying to be disrespectful. It's just like, I just think people should ask questions. I'm asking questions that everybody has. I'm not asking questions that I just am the only person on earth who thinks this stuff. Like, I'm just like, it's interesting that this doesn't look like that. And usually when you go and ask like a pastor or clergy member, they don't go in depth. They don't talk about it like this. They kind of point you toward why the tradition of their denomination is doing things the way that they do. They usually say, because we're more right than all these other more wrong traditions or denominations or groups of people. We're right, they're wrong. So do what I do. Do what we do because we have faith in this. And it's like, okay, cool. But why am I seeing things that don't match up? The first thing that hit me was, well, not the first, but one of the first things that hit me was like, the denomination I came from, was always like, well, we're the closest to the Bible. We do the closest thing to the Bible. We follow all the Bible. Look at what we do. Look at what we do. We follow the Bible because we keep this fourth commandment that other churches don't keep. We do this. Remember the seventh day, and the Sabbath as the seventh day is the Jewish Sabbath, and we actually have worship services on the Sabbath and not on Sunday. We're not following the influence of Constantine. We're doing our own we're getting closer to the original version. And look what else we do. We do certain stuff from Leviticus and Exodus about not eating shellfish and not eating certain types of animals versus eating other animals that are considered more clean. We don't eat pork, we don't eat mussels, we don't eat clams, we eat cleaner stuff similar to what Jewish people eat. And I was like, okay, I can kind of see that. But then I started talking to my Jewish friends, and I'm like, oh, well, you guys keep kosher, but we say that we follow things closer to what Judaism follows, so why don't we keep kosher? It's like, yeah, we follow the same Bible section, but how come you guys do it in this kosher thing, in this kosher method, and we don't? And then I started seeing other things, and I was like, okay, well, Jews follow all these commandments, all the commandments in the Old Testament, but we don't do any of the ones before or after this stuff that's talking about the food. Why don't we wear tassels on the four corners of our garments or do all this other kind of stuff? But they do it, but we don't do any of this other stuff, but they do all the other stuff. Like, why? And I would ask, and I would never get any answers. And so I was like, okay, this is leading me nowhere. They would never say, oh, we just don't do what Jews do because we're not Jewish, or, they never could explain why we do some of the commandments but not all of them, even though we say that we are closer to right because we do some of them but not all of them. And then I started asking, well, Messianic Jews technically do all of the Old Testament commandments just like Jews do. So if Adventism is saying that they're closer to the truth because of them following a few of the Old Testament commandments that other modern day Christians don't follow anymore, then why aren't Messianic Jews considered the better religion to be, because they're following all of them? And then they would say nothing basically that made any sense whatsoever. And so I was like, okay, I already started seeing discrepancies, and I wasn't asking questions to be a jerk. I was just like, okay, I see what you're saying, but why do we do this? And then they would always never answer the question. They wouldn't even give a half thought out answer of anything. They would just kind of avoid it. And I was like, okay, well, because I was thinking well, if that's your logic, then what about this? And they were just like, well, we don't do that. And I was like, well, why? And they're like, we just don't. It's like, okay. So if I want to follow the Old Testament holy days and feast days in the Old Testament, I'm looked at as weird if I don't celebrate Christmas and Easter and all these other things. But if I celebrate the Jewish Sabbath, then that's okay. It's like we're kind of picking and choosing here. And I started noticing that more and more. And the more I started studying all kinds of stuff, I was like, why is everybody just why are these people in charge just never answering any questions? Because I have a lot of questions. And so I started looking into the questions I had and trying to figure out where historically people were making these decisions, why they were making these decisions, why we don't learn about all these other religions. We just learn about our own. Because I was meeting, I was raised in LA. I met so many people from so many different backgrounds. I was always like talking to them, and I was like, well, they think they're right. And I'm being told that how I was raised was right, and I'm pretty sure they were being told the same things. And so what the heck, So I just always found it interesting, being raised around religious people who kind of teach you not to question, and they look at you weird if you do things that you think are right when nobody else is doing them, and then they look at you weird when you talk about things as, you study different things from other different groups of people. I can't tell you how many friends I grew up with that were like, that still, I still know people that I've known since I was like 5 that, have a certain weird view of me because I don't reject things right away. Like, when I see something different, I actually pull towards it. I don't pull away from it. I'm usually like, ooh, what's that? I don't know about this thing. I want to learn about it a little bit. I want to, like, delve into that and watch that and see what they do there. And, like, why did they do that? Like, what's that thing that they're doing? And, like, why don't I do that? Like, they seem like they're getting benefit from that thing, and we don't do that thing, And it's like, I like to know what works for people. Because, I think it's really cool to learn from other cultures about stuff that they do that I've never known about, but obviously it benefits them. Just like I was mentioning, like the mindfulness, the deep breathing, that kind of stuff, that's life-changing for so many people. Even if they don't become the religions that do it, just learning about it for a lot of people can really, really, really improve their mental health. And it's like, there's so many things around the world like that, learning about like the Japanese diet or the Indian food diet. It's like, you can heal a lot of things about your physical body just by changing your diet. But if you never learn about all these other cultural things, and you're raised in a culture that everybody dies or gets obese and has all these problems early on in life, I can't tell you how many friends I have near their 40s that had heart attacks or near heart attacks. I probably have at least 5 that I can think of right off the top of my head. And these people are relatively healthy. Most of them now have changed a lot of their ways, but most of them were drinking and smoking all the time and didn't really exercise enough and didn't eat properly. That's mostly what it was. It wasn't too much off from that. Like, most of them just did those few things or didn't do those few things. And by their 40s were already having issues. I'm not judging it. I'm just saying, like, 40 isn't that young. I'm not that far from there, guys. And to think about having a heart attack at like 40, I'm like, wow, that's young. And just looking at different cultures and stuff like that can help you live longer. I see a lot of benefit in other cultures. Not necessarily a lot of benefit in always looking at my own background and saying, like, picking it apart and seeing what's right and what's wrong. Because there's definitely a lot in how I was raised that worked for me too, and does still work for me now, which is why I don't completely drop it. But there are parts of it that I'm like, this could maybe be tweaked to be a little bit better. And I'm not always looking for the answer specifically for that, but if I do see something that's way different, I do like to kind of know about it, just because there's probably some benefit there somewhere of something I've never ever heard of on the face of the planet or in my whole entire lifetime. I can't tell you how many times I've watched a YouTube video of some random cultural thing where I'm like, oh, that would be like super cool, and even if I don't do it, just to know that there's something like that exists, that other people around the world have done this thing and made it work, and they look so happy, and seem like it's really so beneficial to them, and we're missing out over here. If I never would have even looked at it, I wouldn't even know that it was an option. If I was like, oh, I don't understand this language, I'm not going to click on that, or like, I see people of this skin tone, oh no, I'm not going to click on that, it's like, I like to just dive in there and be like, oh, this is different from me completely. Like, let me click on this and see what happens, or let me read this book or learn about this person and see what happens. I don't always like gravitate towards doing all the stuff that people do. It's cool to know about, just in case you want to try it for later. Just in case you want to delve into it a little bit later and find something beneficial there. And the more you dive into different cultures, you'll usually find something beneficial for yourself, even if you're not doing it exactly like they do it. You can always sift it out into your own perspective, through your own lens, and do something that way. But that's kind of why I like to question all kinds of stuff. And for entertainment, I mean, I find it very interesting to like have a question and look for how many different questions come out of it, with potential possible answers or versions of answers. I like that a lot. Obviously, I also wouldn't be doing it all the time, but I'm basically recording because I can't sleep, and I'm like, well, this is what was on my mind earlier, so I'm just gonna get on with my night then, and go to bed. But with that, thanks for listening.